Today, we're going to examine two key events in westward expansion, the Pony Express and the Transcontinental Railroad. Both events, strategies, and plans began before the American Civil War and took place during, and one of them eventually after, the Civil War was happening, primarily in the eastern coast. On the western coast, there was new transformations taking place. As people are trying to get mail and information for their banks delivered across the U.S. from California to the East Coast, there would be all types of new express or business ventures being taken place on various stagecoaches and wagons. The Pony Express would become the most legendary and iconic of these, yet it would barely last little under 2 years in its time. The Pony Express itself is simply a private business company whose sole purpose was to send through land mail and packages from the East Coast all the way to California and Oregon in the West Coast. The purpose of having this private venture was to not have your Christmas presents and your gifts and your wedding invites have to go on boat and sail all the way around South America to reach San Francisco. But here was a company who said, if you pay us high expense fees, $85 per every ounce of letter package, we guarantee and can deliver that message to California or to New York City in under 3 weeks' time, saving nearly an entire 6 months before that message would ever be delivered, cutting it by a vast number. The Pony Express would go from St. Joseph, Missouri, just north of Kansas City today, all the way to San Francisco. Throughout its time, the Pony Express was run with a series of stations. Each station had riders at it with horses. Each individual would carry the next bag of mail nearly 75 to 100 miles, arrive at the next station, hand it off to the next rider, and they would continue on, helping this process only then last between 2 and 3 weeks. In the process of the Pony Express, there would be a lot of severe obstacles that riders would have to overcome. There would be snowstorms, there would be rain, there were accounts of attacks by Native Americans on these journeys. One particular instance, a rider was going through a snowstorm in a blizzard, arrives at the next station, and there was no rider there to be found. So even after doing over 80 miles of riding in the dark and through the snow, at that time, he grabbed a new horse and continued riding and did a second shift through the wilderness to make it to his next place. Some of those stations that used to be there across Nevada and Utah and Colorado are now in remains and rubble, while others near such places as Gothenburg, Nebraska, have been preserved in their original state as one of those stations to carry mail and delivery. A few of those pieces are still preserved in museums around the world today. And what eventually brings the Pony Express to an end is the development of the telegraph wires being planted all the way across the land, connecting the East Coast to the West Coast. And when Morse code and telegraph wiring can just transmit the message in lightning speed pace, and it can be retranscribed by a secretary in California from a message being arrived from Boston in Massachusetts, there is no longer a need for horse riders on land. So within 19 months, the Pony Express goes away, but through many Midwest towns from Kansas and Missouri through Nebraska, Nevada, Utah, and into California still hold a cherished history of being those areas where the Pony Express once went through. Even in recent times, there have been marathoners who have retraced the exact route of the Pony Express, that even though riders could do it in less than 20 days, a runner would take over 40 days at extreme paces. And then the next part in the evolution of connecting the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States and bringing the country together is the Transcontinental Railroad, connecting the entire continent from Pacific to Atlantic Oceans. It goes back to the story of Senator Douglas from Illinois in his debates with Abraham Lincoln to become the senator of Illinois and wanting that railroad to go from Illinois and Chicago all the way to the West Coast and passing through these territories that led to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, to the Bleeding Kansas situation, and into eventually the American Civil War. That piece of legislation would be approved and a transcontinental railroad would be constructed now that Kansas and Nebraska were territories in eventual U.S. states. there are going to be two companies to construct the Transcontinental Railroad during and after the American Civil War. One is the Central Pacific, beginning in Sacramento. The other is the Union Pacific, beginning in Council Bluffs and Omaha, Nebraska. Eventually, its completion would take place slightly in the middle in what is today called Promontory Point, Utah, just outside of Salt Lake City. Two major companies being hired by the government to construct this during the Civil War. Many of the laborers for the Union Pacific in the east were Irish immigrants coming over, and many of the laborers that were hired by the Central Pacific were Chinese and immigrants coming from Japan and Asia to deal with very dangerous and high explosive and climate environment situations that led to various casualties, injuries, and damage for very little pay in the process. Part of the reason why the Union Pacific constructed more land, a railroad and land in the process, is because it is flatter across Nebraska and the plains of southern Wyoming versus the Central Pacific had to go through the rigorous Sierra Nevadas and through the Rocky Mountains, slowing down the process. Part of the reason why these companies also took on the challenge of building the Transcontinental Railroad is because the government didn't have much money to pay them with. So what the government would pay them with as a return is acreage and land. That for every railroad track that's laid down, the mileage of 80 miles north and south of the railroad track would belong to these railroad companies. So rather than making a straight railroad line, they would actually wind it back and forth through mountains in order to acquire more land holdings after its completion. So you have the Union Pacific from Omaha, Nebraska, going across hills and valleys. It was overseen by a Union general, Mr. Dodge, and the Dodge House is still there in Council Bluffs, Iowa to this day. On the other side, beginning out in San Francisco and Sacramento, would be a man named Leland Stanford. And through the wealth and profits of his own private industries and business ventures, he would go on to be a philanthropist and found a university outside of San Francisco called Stanford University, through which its first graduate is said to be Herbert Hoover, a future U.S. president. This 7-year-long project, over 1,700 miles long, would go through mountains, over rivers, through bridges, required dynamite and explosives. People injured, people were died, and after the American Civil War, during that time of Reconstruction, 1869, it would finally be completed, celebrated with a golden spike. And all types of projects and work and soil were needed to use, either soil to be added, soil to be removed, and again, of using laborers and immigrants. This is a story, again, of having job opportunities, people coming to the U.S. to seek something better, going through very rough circumstances in the process, risking their lives, risking being away from everyone else for very little pay, and not only building the railroad and laying down the steel and the wooden planks, but also building that telegraph wire in the process. Eventually, it was completed in 1869, but there are multiple unique factors within these kind of celebratory images, with the golden spike being laid down. That in this, you don't see any of those immigrant workers who are Chinese in the photograph. Their role in this story is almost non-existent just through the images itself. At the same time, many of these came from a specific Chinese province in the south of China, and many of them either returned or they started those early Chinatown communities going from Omaha, Nebraska, all the way to San Francisco. 13 years later, pressure from Californians led Congress to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. It was the first federal law in America's history which barred immigrants to America based on race or their class. It prevented Chinese immigrants already in the U.S. from becoming citizens, and for nearly 50 more years, only a handful of Chinese merchants, teachers, and students were permitted to enter the United States. The celebratory golden spike is in the Smithsonian today. It has its various etchings on its sides that can still be found on display. That would God continue to unite the country as the railroad unites the two great oceans of the world. And today, Promontory Point, Utah, as a national park site, celebrating those two unions of the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads. saw in the back of the Utah State Quarter, and it would have long-lasting implications for the West, as Native Americans would further be limited and restricted as to where they could live. Sometimes they would tamper with the railroad lines. It also impacted the bison population migrating through the Midwest, and it opened up the floodgates to the West for more settlers, goods, and products, and ranchers to arrive in the region. And wherever the railroad was, nearby towns began to spring up. Places like Cheyenne, Wyoming, Ogden, Utah, and Columbus, Nebraska. Union Pacific itself almost went bankrupt as a corporation by financial mishandlings. It was eventually purchased by millionaire Jay Gould, who would bring it back into a thriving process where today Union Pacific is one of the Forbes 500 Fortune 500 companies in the U.S., and it would lead to further American expansion into Western states and territories. It would help benefit the country, bring in resources from the East Coast and West Coast to one another. It would cut down communication, travel time, allow immigrants coming from Europe and Asia to migrate through the U.S., and it would have a significant impact on the Plains Indians. And with that, we will look at furthering events from this expansion into the West next time.